Welcome to Poveglia Island, a hauntingly beautiful and enigmatic location situated in the Venetian lagoon, just off the coast of Italy. This small island, with its dark and mysterious past, has captured the imaginations of many intrigued by tales of paranormal activity and unsettling history. Known as one of the most haunted places in the world, Poveglia Island carries an eerie reputation that has drawn curious visitors and thrill seekers from around the globe.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to MP Paranormal. This will be the 5th installment of The D3ad Shall Talk. Now, there's no fair warning before we start this podcast. There's no disclaimer. It's going to be pretty tame today. We figured we might have scared you pretty bad with the last episode we did. Today, we're going to be talking about a little island in Italy, specifically called Poveglia Island, which is also considered the Haunted Isle. Now, Dylan and his wife, Alice, have actually been to just the feet of the island right before you cross the lake. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so we walked down a little strip of land south of Venice called Lido, and she actually hated my guts for that day because we had to walk like 5 kilometers, and we basically walked all the way down the lagoon just to take some pictures.
Yes, that's true. Confirm that.
And the reason you did a 5-kilometer hike to get to this island is because it has somewhat of a reputation, does it not?
Yes. So from my American perspective, and Alice talk on it here in a second, but from my American perspective, I just know about the blood and death that occurred there, which is probably one of the most brutal and high volume amounts of dead persons in history in such a short period of time.
And a lot of it ties into the plague, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, so the Black Death, in was it the 1300s?
Yes, I would say. Yeah, end of 1200s. Yeah, 1300s.
So we did a little bit of research about Poveglia Island. Did I say that right, Alice?
Yes, it was good. That was good.
I was going to say Poveglia. That's my American accent coming in. Poveglia Island. So it's actually situated in the Venetian lagoon, and it holds this sinister reputation, and it's actually called the Island of Ghosts. It was once a quarantine center and mass grave for victims of the bubonic plague. It has become infamous as one of Europe's most haunted places, amidst the rich tapestry of paranormal tales that saturate Italy. Now, the dark history of Poveglia Island, like you said, Dylan, it's just spanning a mere 17 acres, but there's been so much grim past on this island, even since its earliest days. So, in the 14th century, Europe succumbed to the devastating Black Death. In that, it was an epidemic that claimed the lives of millions and decimated entire populations within months or even weeks. Now, I want to kind of harp on a personal story. I've been to the catacombs in Paris, France, and, they kind of detail how gruesome and just macabre and morbid this Black Death was. You know, if you opened a bottle of wine outside, it would turn to vinegar instantly. If you had milk outside, it would rot into cheese. Anything that you brought outside, there was so much death and so much just decay that it would just literally rot food, and it would just make people sick.
Sounds biblical, dude. Like let's try a bottle of wine, and it just spoils. It's just like,
yeah, like immediately, because the stench and the death is just so rampant. But anyway, in Venice, a dominant trading port during the Middle Ages and Renaissance era, it utilized these islands in the Venetian lagoon to control and isolate outbreaks of this plague. Now, Poveglia Island emerged as Venice's solution to this horrific problem that we're talking about, where you couldn't even go outside without projectile vomiting or food spoiling. So it became an isolated quarantine site where victims were sent, rarely to leave its shores ever again. And can we just pause and think about that for a second? Like, you've caught the plague, you're done for, and your last memories before dying on an island with a bunch of other sick people is being ferried over to this island to be sentenced to death, basically. I can't imagine like the feelings and just the kind of stain that's kind of most likely left on the island.
Yeah, just like, you're blacking out because you got the plague, and you wake up in some sort of like canal boat, and you just have some apothecary with a bird mask, just like, rowing a boat, and you're just like, where the hell am I? And you're going to the island, son. Oh,
So
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was quite crazy is that, of course, they couldn't differentiate between those that, maybe had mild symptoms that just caught it, that maybe were still, in a acceptable state, and those that were, in an advanced state. So everyone would just be grouped together on this island, and it's terrible, to think about that. You, as maybe someone who just caught the plague, would see everyone around you, living through this thing, knowing that it was awaiting you as well. It must have been crazy for sure. So, yeah, and the whole, the plague doctors and all that, that's surely part of the history of Venice. If you go there, you see all the masks. So, that's not just for show. That was actually part of the history of the city. So, yeah. Quite
now the
insane.
masks would have protected them, at least in theory,
Mhm.
from getting sick, right? But they actually stuffed perfumes and flowers in the nose, in the end of the nose. So, they're around all these sick people and dying people. At least the air that they're breathing in would be somewhat pleasant.
well, they would stuff it with, if I'm not mistaken, sage and other herbs like that because of the belief. I mean, sage has a long been believed to be a negativity cleanser, so that they would filter their breath with sage, so that the illness and even I think it was believed that like bad energies and bad spirits could not pass into the nasal passage, because I've talked to you before this, and it's commonly thought that negative energies and spirits come in through the breath. So that's why they put sage and herbs with properties like that in the beak of the mask.
Now, if I'm recalling my grade schooling correctly, it was actually the fleas that caused the plague, wasn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So the plague was carried by rats, and that's why Venice, being the port authority that it was over the years, a lot of the times, it started in Nepal, in Central Asia, and those rats carried bubonic, and then they got onto ships. Those ships sailed into Europe. Those rats off-boarded or jumped onto human hosts, and then started biting people who were around those rats that got the fleas, and that's how that disease spread so rampantly.
Wouldn't life be more simple if, it wasn't the whole global economy, if we all just like minded our own business? I don't think epidemics or plagues, I mean, we just got over COVID, right? Like, if we just didn't have to be everywhere all the time, I don't think these things would affect humanity like they do. But, we've advanced so much, it's almost to our detriment when it comes to epidemics and plagues. It's just really interesting to think about because they'll never go away. We might see another plague. My dad witnessed the Spanish flu way back when.
Really?
Yeah, there's always like plagues and epidemics and just despair, and they just come and go. Mother Nature's way.
Yeah, imagine
But
how fast it would have spread, in today's
modern
time. Like
times,
something, yeah, incredible. And it decimated, the European population back then. So I don't know what it would do right now. But
The
yeah.
the 14th century bubonic decimated one third, 33% of the European population.
and that small island, it actually harbored more than 160,000 plague victims. And authorities actually took drastic measures, not limited to quarantine alone. It was actually to prevent the disease's spread. They resorted to burning the corpses. And it is believed that the island's soil still consists of more than 50% human ash from these cremations. So the very earth and soil that you walk on is literally human remains. If we can imagine, however many acres we said it was, 17 and 160,000 bodies piled on that, all dying and being burned. The very earth that you walk on must be cursed. And Poveglia became an eerie reflection of hell in northern Italy. That's how they began to see it.
Yeah, and what's really interesting to me is that the 160,000 is a guesstimate. It's a guesstimate to the amount of people. And if you've ever seen the Ghost Adventures video of Poveglia, when Zach goes to the back, so the island is separated. It's two small islands. So you have the one island where the mental hospital used to be, which we'll get into after the history and some other stuff. And the other side is the burial fields. And it has a bridge that connects it. So when he went over to the burial fields and he stuck his knife into the dirt, common sense would say that dirt is pretty heavy, has a little bit of mass to it, so it should fall straight down. But when he flung his knife up, it was just ash.
Even to this day.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was reading that besides this, the few construction work that they did on the island, when they dig deep enough, they're still finding remains, maybe some pieces here and there that weren't, burned completely. So yeah, that's still being found to this day. So just gives you the idea of the volume of corpses that were burned in the area.
Oh, yeah. And with that, let's get into the history, right? So, right, nestled in this picturesque Venetian lagoon, and Alice and I can attest to this, it's beautiful. Venice is lovely. It houses 166 islands, and Poveglia has hosted inhabitants since at least the 5th century. So during that time, the Romans sought refuge on defensible lagoon islands to escape invasions by the Goths. Am I saying that right, Alice?
I'm not sure what the English pronunciation
It was.
is, but
We were
yeah,
talking about it earlier. They were like Germanic
yeah.
tribes, right?
Absolutely, yeah, those.
Yep, them and
Quite bloody, yeah.
yeah, them and the Huns. And as Venice grew, Poveglia Island gained strategic importance as a defensive outpost. So in the 14th century, the Venetians, excuse me, constructed a fort serving as a deterrent against enemy ships attempting to reach the city. And I don't know if this is true or this isn't true, but apparently that fort that the Romans built was hit by a freak wave in the lagoon, and it killed a lot of Roman soldiers. I don't know if that's true or not. I've just heard that. And when the bubonic plague came into Europe, Poveglia became the swift and permanent solution to the outbreak. So as early as the 16th century, it transformed into a crucial quarantine site for plague victims. And alongside with that quarantine function, Poveglia became an immense burial ground where barges from Venice transported the deceased, which we were talking about earlier with the apothecaries, while smaller ships brought exiles during that time when they displayed even the most mild symptoms of the plague. And like Alice was talking about, they had a lot of trouble differentiating whether these people were severely infected by the plague, not infected by the plague, or just slightly infected by the plague. Didn't matter. You were going. And with that being said, those plague victims endured a 40-day period on Poveglia, whether they would recover or die, with the latter being the most unfortunate reality for most. And countless bodies were cremated or left in mass graves, as we were talking about, as the island's capacity to bury them was overwhelmed.
Yeah, do you really think you're going to have a good recovery if you're being sent to an island with a bunch of people in advanced stages of the plague or dying or dead?
Well, I mean, this is
Your chances, it's basically a death sentence. Imagine, I mean, we complained about COVID and like all the mandates and all that. Can you imagine the government stepping in and being like, hey, we're just going to kill all these people and shove them to an island and burn them? Hey, it's all good.
It's insane because, those who don't know how the plague affected people. So basically these fleas would bite you, and very, very, very quickly your body would just erupt in sores. So basically you would feel okay, and then all of a sudden you would just be deathly ill and these sores would just explode all over your body, your lymph nodes.
It was the lymph nodes, wasn't it?
Correct. Yep.
It's fighting an infection. Yeah.
Correct. The lymph nodes would get extremely large. I mean, we're talking like the size of like apples, like very, very, very large. So much fluid being pumped through by the lymphatic system that it had no idea what to do with it. So you would just lump up, and then eventually fever would set in because you would start to go septic, and these lymph nodes would start bursting, and then you would just die. It's pretty gnarly stuff.
With that, we're kind of talking about how they were containing this plague. And that wasn't even the worst of it. So in 1348, when the deadliest outbreak of this bubonic plague, known as the Black Death, and that's what we know it as today, it struck Europe, Venice pioneered the first modern quarantine system. So the Republic implemented a 40-day detention period for ships and travelers suspected of carrying the plague. Hence the origin of the term quarantine. That's actually where we got the word. I mean, and look, we're using the word today. I mean, we all went through quarantine through COVID-19, and I'm going to butcher this Italian word. So, I don't even know how to say it. Alice,
Yeah.
how do you say quarantine in Italian?
Yeah, it's a quarantena, which exactly comes from the word quaranta, which means 44, 40. So that's quite interesting that this trace, has been left in the language, really. And, I guess that was the only way that they had, to figure out. But like we were saying, was it really figuring out if people had it, or was it just separating them,
Imagine the
Well,
fear and just like, yep, they got it. Like, who gets to determine that? If you,
mm,
or We talk about how we didn't have any rights during COVID. I just can't imagine the brutality of this. Like, it's nuts to me.
Yeah, and then, everyone who was left behind that wasn't maybe sick, all the relatives had, no graves to go to or no way to know what was happening. Yeah, it must have been insane. I know other times, but still, quite brutal. Yeah.
And this proved to be largely ineffective at best. The urgent need to halt this disease's spread led other regions to adopt similar practices. The Duke of Milan, during a resurgence of the plague in 1374, exiled all plague sufferers to a field outside the city. In Ragusa, is that how you say it, Alice?
Yes.
Oh, I got it. And that's on the Dalmatian coast. A quarantine station was established to isolate individuals from plague-ridden areas. Furthermore, Marseille introduced a maritime quarantine in the early 16th century, while Frankfurt in the 17th century forbade those residing in plague-affected houses from attending public gatherings. Even colonial New York established a quarantine station on the island, now known as Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty stands. Isn't that such a juxtaposition? Like, it's the island of Liberty, but it used to be a quarantine island.
Yeah. I was actually a little shocked when I heard that, but it makes a lot of sense for, Manhattan. It's really one of the closest islands to where it'd be very, very accessible to ship people off to hold them if they were showing any. Now, granted, this is far into the future. I mean, we're talking about the immigration period of the United States, right? So the late 1800s, early 1900s, but still, I mean, this is how impactful this event was on world history and how many notes people were taking in regards to how to deal with sickness.
It's interesting, I think, that, a big wave of those immigrants that were held up, and had medical checks performed on them were actually Italians, that was like one of the biggest waves of immigration. So it's quite funny that there's that tie there as well.
Yeah, and there was a system that was put into place by Venice. It was the Lazaretto, if I'm saying that correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So the Lazaretto system of plague quarantine stations. And Lazaretto is actually interesting because it comes from the word, and Alice, correct me if I'm wrong, from the word Lazarus, who was the individual that God brought back from the dead, correct?
Yeah, exactly. Jesus, it's a biblical episode. He was brought back by him after 4 days that he was declared dead. So I think it's quite interesting that, they chose this name, kind of giving a false sense of hope. They chose the name of someone who was brought back from death after 4 days and calling these places like that where they knew there was, no such thing. I don't think they really believed in that. So yeah, it's quite an interesting choice of a name.
Yeah, and because the plague took such a heavy toll on Venice's population in 1348, it resulted in a loss of half of its citizens after everything was said and done. I mean, that's insane. Half of the citizens of Venice were just completely cleansed off by this virus. It makes sense to why people back then would think that it is some sort of great plague, like from God. I mean, you can just think that everybody is just dropping dead. You have no understanding of what's going on. I mean, it makes sense, like this is a God intended disease that is to cull the population.
It's free real estate.
Now, I'm pretty sure some maybe like religious minorities were blamed for this. I can't remember the details, but, there were a lot of heresy going on in Europe, with the Catholic Church and Protestants and, the Calvinist movement and all that. So these plagues were actually blamed, on minorities. Like, oh, it's your fault because you decided to not follow, God. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure the old, because everybody knows that the old, 13th, 14th, 15th century Catholic Church was quite controlling, and they probably jumped right at this to say, hey, look what happens when you believe, you don't believe in a certain thing, you need to do this, or this is what's going to happen to you, right? But Venice, right, being it was an international trade hub for Europe at the time. I mean, it was a very, very, very important port city. And it welcomed ships from all corners of the known world, making it exceptionally vulnerable to the spread of diseases, which we were talking about how this originated in Central Asia somewhere. So in response, Venice established a network of lazaretto, or plague quarantine stations across the lagoon island. And by the 18th century, and remember, this plague just went on and went on and went on, right? And there were new plagues that popped up after it. Poveglia became the most prominent among these inspection ports. And in 1485, following another plague outbreak that claimed the life of Venice's ruler, I believe it's Giovanni Mocenigo,
Yeah.
Mocenigo. The city established several quarantine colonies on isolated islands. Those affected by the plague were confined to these islands until they recovered or succumbed to the disease, like earlier in time of the bubonic. And with that, the number of corpses on Poveglia soon overwhelmed the city's burial capacity, which we touched on it a little bit ago, that the island could not keep up with the death. And it's noted that up to 500 people a day were dying on these islands. And these workers, they call them corpse carriers. How would you say corpse carrier in Italian?
Oh, I'm not sure. Portatore di cadaveri, perhaps,
Mm.
or
And
becchino. That's what we would call someone who deals with corpses in Italian.
okay. So these individuals struggled to keep up with the relentless burial demands, often mistaking the dying or severely ill for the deceased and inadvertently piling them onto existing corpses. So if you've ever seen, I think it's Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's like, bring out your dead, ding ding, bring out your dead, and
I have seen that scene. Yes,
and he
pretty
grabs
much. Yeah.
and he grabs the guy and he's like, oh, I'm not dead, and he just hits him over the head with a broom or something. Pretty
I
much.
mean, there just must have been a huge loss of humanity by that point. Like, you're so overwhelmed with people who are dying. It's like, you're about to die anyway. See ya. Throw you into the fire, into the body pit. I don't know. Sounds awful though.
Yeah, absolutely. If one thing humanity has always tried to do was, to respect the dead and bury them in a way that was, that meant to preserve the dignity of the person that died. This is exactly the opposite. So absolutely.
Yeah, and in 1777, the Magistrate of Health in Venice, I didn't even know they had one of those back then, they mandated that Poveglia become Venice's primary plague checkpoint. So this is where all ships destined for Venice were required to stop for inspection, and any sailors showing signs of the plague were immediately quarantined on the island. So you can imagine, just think about a normal port. So let's think of like the Suez Canal or something like that. Have you ever seen videos of the Suez Canal? Just ships, 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 ships. I can imagine it was relatively similar for a hustle and bustle trade port like that. And you could just imagine being a sailor coming in from another area. Maybe you know about the plague stations, maybe you don't, but knowing that you might be ill and just sailing up to this island and knowing that that's it. And what's interesting, and Alice, I think we were talking about it when we were flying over it, I think, or maybe we were on a boat. We were looking off at it at a distance, and it was a beautiful blue, clear day. And Poveglia was the only island with a swirl of cloud around it.
Yeah, I remember that's true.
Concentrated evil.
Yeah, dude. It's just like this daunting place.
It's like a video game like level. Like, that's where the bad place is. That being said, are we ever going to investigate this place or?
Oh, man. It's funny. She was just watching a video while she was getting ready for the podcast, and it was some dudes that were exploring the island, and I asked her, I said, how did they get there? She's like, oh, they paid somebody to bring them over there. And so if we ever take a trip over there, I will definitely grease the palm of a boat taxi to take me over there. Apparently people are doing barbecues on the island, Alice was telling me.
Yeah. I was reading that. So they are trying, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk about the present of the island, but they're trying to turn it into something, that people can enjoy, people can go to it and have barbecues with families. So I don't know how that will, turn out considering everything that happened. But yeah, there's no public transport. The island is completely cut off, which is interesting because, most islands like Murano, Burano, Lido, you can go to them, you can, go around and whatnot. But Poveglia is like cut out from everything. I don't know. So also this adds to, the aura of mystery, I guess. So you need to find someone who's willing to take you there. And the documentary that I was watching, the people that took, these investigators to the island didn't want to leave the boat. So they just, approached the island, let them, get off, and they didn't even set foot on it and just, went back. So I guess it is kind of a thing among people, that live in Venice as well, that, better not go there.
to my understanding, the locals believe that the island is cursed. And I think when we were down there, which was super interesting.
That's a fair assumption.
Yeah. When we were down there, right, we walk all this way down there and there's boats going by all the time, right, in Venice. Boats. It's just nonstop boats. And you get down to the tip of Lido and all the boats just stop around the island. I mean, I think we saw maybe 1 or 2 boats, but none of them were even remotely close to being towards the island. It's like they avoid it, no pun intended, like the plague.
Yeah, and this makes me think of the fact that the main cemetery of Venice, so, people that die there are buried in an island. So the cemetery is a separate island, from the main area where, the city of Venice is. And people go there, that's okay. But weirdly enough, Poveglia, no. Poveglia is really left out of all the routes and, so something that's interesting, I think, Italian people don't really talk too much about paranormal. I think it's maybe a big interest, but they still avoid it. It's still a thing that they don't really want to go to, talk about. So there has to be something. If even Italians are like, no, get me out of there. I don't want to get to it.
That's the funny thing about the paranormal. It's like nobody believes in ghosts, but they're afraid of them. So you do believe in ghosts. You just don't want to
Very
deal with
true.
it. You don't want to think about it.
Yeah,
But y'all heard it here first. MP Paranormal, Poveglia Island, Italy. And Alice, you were talking about that element of mystery. So it goes even deeper than that. And this is where it gets really interesting. So in 1922, the island took on a new role when a mental hospital was constructed there. And that seems like a fantastic idea. Let's open up a mental hospital where all these bodies and all these tragic acts occurs. It definitely won't be haunted. But soon, rumors circulated about a doctor at the hospital who conducted gruesome experiments on patients and ultimately met his own demise. And he did this by falling from a bell tower high up on Poveglia Island. Now, the local legend suggests that the tormented spirits of the patients drove him to this madness, compelling him to climb the tower and plunge to his death. Allegedly, this doctor engaged in inhumane practices such as lobotomies, extracting brain samples from living patients, and administering high-voltage electrical shocks. The hospital ceased operations in 1968, leaving Poveglia Island abandoned once again. Now, the stories of the plague victims and mistreated psychiatric patients haunting the island persist to this day, just like you were saying, Alice. People avoid it like the plague.
Yeah, and it's really weird. Like, I mean, the island is not far from the little spot we were in Lido. I mean, really, if the current of the lagoon wasn't so strong, you could jump right in there and swim. I mean, what would you say, like 500 meters maybe?
Unless, it's deceivingly close, but it looked close, like you could, reach it swimming. But
What if you got tired halfway and then turned back?
yeah, I mean, if you're almost there, just to go. But, the fact that it's cut off from public transport, people that want to go there, investigate at night, they're kind of, blocked there, which also I think it's not the best thing. But, connecting to what you were saying about the hospital and all that, I was reading that they tried to frame it as a sort of, house for the elderly kind of thing. They called it a sort of place for the elderly. But on the island, they found kind of signs that said, psychiatric ward in them. So it was definitely that sort of hospital. And it's a great idea, like you were saying, to lock these people up that maybe already have issues, personality disorders and all that, in a place where maybe they hear voices that maybe belong to someone, who died there, if you, of course, believe in this. So it's a very dangerous mix, I think, of things to put, these people there where, paranormal phenomena probably happened.
Yeah, and what's even more interesting with that is that what draws locations like this to just perpetually go down this brutal rabbit hole of just darkness? There's got to be something to say, because it's not the only place in the world that's like this. You have these places that have such a stained history, whether the land is stained or the previous building, whatever it may be, and it just perpetually just gets worse and worse and worse, and then eventually it comes to a stop.
Yeah, and the bottom line being not only it was a psychiatric hospital, but also this, horrific doctor operated there. And it seems like that's quite certain, like I was reading that the dates coincide, the age of the doctor coincides, so it was probably him. Um, and yeah, maybe he fell, maybe he killed himself. This is also a theory that I read. He kills himself jumping off the bell tower, which you can see very clearly, right, from the Lido. It's one of the most prominent sites on the island. You can really see it, and thinking that, he jumped off of that just to conclude everything, really. But yeah, I don't know if you will touch also on the more recent history. But in 2016, and maybe you have also read about this, but in 2016, there was a group of American investigators. They were from Colorado, and they wanted to investigate, Poveglia. They were brought there, wanted to spend the night, but apparently in the middle of the night, someone who was going by heard the screams coming from the island, and it was these 5 people that were in shock, that were screaming for help. And this was like on the Italian news, on the Italian, newscast. They were in shock and they called for help, and they were, rescued by the firefighters, the Italian firefighters. They were brought to the ER because they were acting, like in shock. They left everything that they had brought with them, all the expensive equipment on the island, because they were completely out of their minds, So stuff happens also, and this was 2016, so, it's really endless.
While you were telling me that story, literally all the hair on my arms stood up, because that's like so creepy as hell to think that these dudes went to go investigate. Who knows what happens? Did they ever have a follow-up to like talk to these guys?
I'm not sure, because the news just talked about, them being, in shock and just telling a few things that they had experienced. But, people probably, discarded whatever they were saying. Oh, they're just crazy. They imagined it. So it would be interesting to hear what they had to say. But to be, in shock, like 5 of them all having the same experience, I don't know. It's quite telling, I think.
Well, to even get to the island as well, you're facing a hefty fine, if you get stopped by the Italian police. So for me, that's where the stress would come in. I can deal with ghosts and all that good stuff, but well, we might get arrested too. Let's stack that on top. So yeah, I can understand you kind of being stressed out before you even get there, and then crazy paranormal phenomenon starts happening, and you're just like, nope, I'm out.
Yeah, that's a perfect off-ramp to the history of the hauntings of the island. So Brian was just touching on the hefty fine. So it's rumored, I don't know if it's true, but it wouldn't surprise me because it's similar in Pompeii. If you get caught on the island by the Carabinieri, who are like the federal level police out there, it's a 10,000 euro fine. But that, like Alice was just talking about, has not deterred locals and paranormal enthusiasts from attempting to access the island clandestinely via water taxis or ferries or what have you. And the ones that do set foot on the island, just like I can imagine these gentlemen from 2016 experienced, people have reported vivid apparitions, physical touches, scratches, and bruises inflicted by potentially vengeful spirits, witness light anomalies both with their own eyes and through digital cameras, EVPs, audible voices, footsteps, banging noises, and slamming doors all over the place. The prevalent experience shared by a lot of people that go to this island is an overwhelming sense of negative energy and nausea that they say permeates on like every corner of the island. And I think that's just a lingering testimony to this, brutal and dark history.
Absolutely. And I think that just about wraps us up. So if you like what we talked about, feel free to drop us a comment. Go ahead and give us a like, drop a subscribe. We're actually coming out with a lot of investigation videos this summer, and we're going back to the Haunted Hill House on August 12th.
Yeah,
it's going to start our season 3.
Yeah. And also in the oven right now, we have the Parapeculiar Haunted Museum, which you will see air the day before this releases. And then the following week will be the circa 1886 Old Park Hotel in Ballinger, Texas, which different kind of haunting, but one of the most wildly haunted places that I think we've ever investigated. And Alice was there for that one too. Cannot wait to release it to y'all. We're also working on some shorts, but I'm about to get back to work. Brian's back at work as well. So we're going to be in a little bit of a hiatus, but do not worry. These podcasts will still come out weekly every Friday. So with that, we'll see y'all on the next one.
Peace.